Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. My guest today is Professor Michael Drout from Wheaton College in Massachusetts. He's the author of How Tradition Works, Tradition and Influence. And then most excitedly for me, he's the author of some of my very favorite modern scholar courses, The History of the English Language, and the Anglo-Saxon World, and the Norsemen, Vikings, and their culture. And we're going to talk today about Lindisfarne, which is a great place to combine all three of those. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So we're talking about the history of Lindisfarne, and I think for most people, they may not know precisely the story, but they've either heard of the monastery or the sacking of the monastery, or they've heard of the Gospels. What is Lindisfarne exactly?
So Lindisfarne is a small island off the coast of the north of England, near Durham and Newcastle and that area, which is one of my favorite parts of England also. I say an island because it kind of looks like that, but it's not an island for a part of each day. So there's a causeway that runs out there, and when the tide is out, you can drive onto the island. And then when the tide goes in, the causeway is underwater. And apparently people get stuck on the causeway pretty regularly. They have these like lifeguard stand things at different places, and there's all these warnings, like if the water starts to wash over your car, get to that stand and stay on it. And there's all these pictures of cars sunk in the water there. So I guess people don't read the tide tables and don't believe how fast the tide comes in. But in any event, this location, which didn't quite require a boat to get there, but also sort of isolated it a little bit from the local area of Berwick, that made this a very appealing place for monks to go, because they could be separated from that bustling medieval metropolis that was no, but they did. They wanted a place to be separate. That's monasticism was about living separately in an enclosed environment of some sort. And so as early as 635, monks built a monastery on Lindisfarne. And it stayed there, and it was sort of like ended up being the intellectual and artistic heart of England during what we call the golden age of English monasticism in the 8th century. And then it was sacked by the Vikings, kind of indicating the start of the Viking period at the very end in the late 700s. And so it sort of represents the early stage. When I teach my students Anglo-Saxon, I say that the easy way to keep track of the Anglo-Saxon age is the acronym MacGyver. Okay, so the migration is when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came to England. Let's say that's 500 to 600. The conversion, 600 to 700, is the conversion to Christianity. And then the Golden Age, 700 to 800, is this height of cultural production. And then the Viking Age comes after that, and that's really starts Lindisfarne. So Lindisfarne is kind of intimately tied into and the center of three of those ages, the conversion period, the Golden Age, and then the sort of destruction of all of that in the Viking Age.
So who were the monks that lived at Lindisfarne? Were they mostly Anglo-Saxons, or would they have been from Rome?
They were from Ireland, some of them.
Oh, really? Interesting.
So the big thing on Lindisfarne is that King Oswald of Northumbria had been in exile for a while as a young man, fleeing the more powerful kings, and he lived in Iona, which is kind of in between England. It's an island in between England and Scotland. And in Iona, there had been a bunch of Irish monks there, and they had been Christianizing that way from Irish missionaries. So when Oswald gets back to become king of Northumbria, he invites Saint Aidan from Iona to come and start converting the Northumbrians. And so the first monks who came were Irish and Anglo-Saxons who had been educated at Iona with Saint Columba was involved in that, and came with Saint Aidan to build the monastery.
What was their purpose in building a monastery there? Was there any special, like, were there any academic pursuits that they were interested in, or was it just purely to have, like, was it better for the kingdom to have a monastery? Why did they want to pour the resources into it?
Oswald attributed Christianity, like he gave Christianity credit for his success.
Oh,
So, there's one of these stories where at this battle at a place called Heavenfield, Oswald is supposed to lose. Like he's wildly outnumbered, but he puts up a wooden cross and then he wins the battle. And the place was called Heavenfield too. So he attributes his success to God being on his side. And so the idea then is that he's going to get God more on the side of his kingdom by bringing in these very holy men who had, in Iona is very just remote, and, it's cold, it's wet. The monks there we kind of sometimes called Christian athleticism. They were into doing like kind of feats of strength involved with religion. So I'm going to stand waist deep in a freezing cold river in the middle of winter with my arms outstretched in the shape of the cross and recite the entire Psalter from memory. No, I mean, I'm not. They did things like that. They really did, and so that impressed Oswald. So he wanted to convert his kingdom, and so the best thing in his view was to have his own little Iona close by. So he found a place that was like it, an island off the coast that didn't have distractions and so forth. And then he brought these very holy men like Aidan to build it and set the foundations of Christianity in the north.
Now, Lindisfarne is famous for the Lindisfarne Gospel, which means that there were, and if anybody hasn't seen the Lindisfarne Gospel, but maybe they've seen the Book of Kells or another illuminated manuscript, these are, important works, but they're very detailed, very beautiful. It took a lot of work for them to be put together. What were the monks who worked on these manuscripts? What was their day like?
Surprisingly, not as much on the manuscript as you'd think, and way more time spent singing. This is monastic life was a very programmed day. Now, in this early period, the Benedictine rule, the rule of Saint Benedict, which ends up sort of structuring monastic life into a kind of exquisite detail, had not made it to England yet. So the way a monastery worked was that someone who was chosen as abbot, so this would be Aidan in this particular case, had sort of absolute power over structuring the lives of the monks. And when you went to a monastery, you basically took your oath to the abbot to do whatever you were told. So the general rule is poverty, chastity, and obedience. Later on, it becomes obedience to the rule itself. But at this time, it was obedience to the abbot. And the abbot seems to have been extremely charismatic religious leaders. So what they would do, I mean, they would be getting up at 2 a.m. sometimes, singing a mass, having a little morning, an early morning meal, singing another mass, doing private devotions or reading, then working in whatever things need to be done either around the monastery or in the scriptorium and so forth, and then singing another mass or doing more prayer. I mean, in the later period, once you get to like the 900s, for some festivals or important religious holidays in the summer months, you could have up to 19 hours of singing going on. Not that each person sang a full 19 hours. That there was trade-offs and resting and so forth, but it was a lot of programmed devotion, with the idea being that this was a way to get you more in a perfectly devoted religious frame of mind. And so there was also doing kind of physical work and doing and later on more than in the early period, monasteries worked as essentially hospitals, old age homes, like and universities. They sort of had all those institutions that we now have split up, right? We have elder care places, and we have hospitals for the sick, and we have for-profit hotels for travelers, and we have universities and so forth. That was all in the monastery. in one way or the other. So travelers could stop there and get fed, and they would get a donate. They would give a donation. When people in the community, especially wealthy people, were getting too old to take care of themselves or difficult for their families, they would often enter into the monastery and become like a novice monk or live in that area. And they would donate lands as kind of a reward. And then the university stuff was you needed priests who could read Latin in order to convert Christians and hold services. And so you started out teaching people to read Latin, and then what developed from that was this effort of making beautiful books. And the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells, and one other book made in the north, the Codex Amiatinus, which was made at Bede's monastery of Monkwearmouth Jarrow, a little south from Lindisfarne. Those are often considered three of the most beautiful books in the entire Western tradition, and they were all made in England and Ireland, so in north part of Britain, within 100 years or so of each other.
Oh wow! What was the cross currents between those monasteries? Like, were they aware of the work each other was doing and building off of each other?
Yes, and then there became a great rivalry and a big debate about it, because the Irish were following some Christian customs, the most significant being the way that they calculated the date of Easter and the way that they wore their hair as monks, the tonsure. Ireland had been converted and had adopted the customs that we would now associate sort of with Greek Orthodox,
okay,
rather than with Roman Catholicism. And so the Irish, they did some things different. Now, at the same time this is happening in the north, right, the Irish are converting the north. Pope Gregory the Great in England sends missionaries to the south, to Canterbury in Kent, and they are converting from the south to the north. And so when this all met, and when England is finally all Christian, and it's the only bloodless conversion in European history. So for complex reasons, but basically nobody starts murdering missionaries, and also the missionaries don't start like burning down pagan temples and killing pagans and so forth. It's a weird and positive and bloodless conversion. But once everyone's converted, there becomes a big fight between those who are following the Irish customs and those who are following the Roman customs. And there's a debate then held around the 660s, just further south on the coast at Whitby. And it's eventually resolved, and my Irish relatives would say, of course it was resolved this way. It was resolved in favor of the English and the Roman way of doing everything. But there was quite a lot of tension around that, because, there can only be one correct date of Easter, and there can only be one correct way to wear your hair in this view. And so and eventually the English were very clever. They got the king involved. The king of Northumbria chose their side.
Oh, interesting. So did that affect Ireland too, or did that just affect the monasteries that were on Britain?
That mostly just affected Britain. It didn't push back to Ireland, and Ireland is much more complicated because it has a kind of longer continuous history. When these monks are coming and converting England, there's no existing church for them to convert. There's pagans, and there's the ruins of sort of Roman practice. There had been Christians and Christian churches in England, but they're pretty much destroyed by that point. But in Ireland, there's a real close connection between the powerful local chieftains and the religious houses, and so England didn't have any real influence on Ireland. It was the other way around.
Okay.
But one of the weird things that happens is that this changes the writing system, because the Irish, to do the sound for th, so in Latin, right, you just use a th like you do in modern English for that sound. But in Anglo-Saxon and in Old Irish, you could have words that, like a word that had a T and then followed by an H sound, like we would have, like with something like cat house. Okay. We wouldn't say cathouse, right? And we just know that. But there were a lot of words like that. Anglo-Saxon had natwilch and so forth, and so they brought in a new letter to indicate th, and in Irish it's a D with a cross across the vertical ascender line.
Okay.
And that comes into Anglo-Saxon. But once this whole debate gets going, it seems like the Anglo-Saxon writers were a little bit, I don't want to make my writing look too Irish, And so they used a different letter called thorn, which kind of looks like if you crossed a P and a B, so that it goes, there's a vertical ascender and a vertical descender with a little lump in the middle, and that would be thorn. And so that came in from Germanic runes, but I read it as definitely of like, oh, we are not going to look Irish. And so that there's a lot of that going on. At the same time, right, the Lindisfarne Gospels is highly influenced by the Irish art tradition. If you look at the Book of Kells and you look at Lindisfarne Gospels, you can see the crossover there. And both of them also seem to be influenced by Byzantine art, by stuff from the East that probably came into Ireland and England in the form of textiles that have now been completely lost, but were at that time were used to wrap the beautiful books. And so there's a real, a lot of cross-cultural ferment going on at the same time that these people are on an island in the middle of nowhere.
Well, my listeners will know that I'm kind of obsessed with Eastern European and Greek Orthodox monasteries. So we've actually done episodes about Rila Monastery in Bulgaria and the Painted Churches of Moldavia. So if anybody's interested in the Eastern tradition, they should definitely go check out those episodes if they haven't heard them already.
Oh, that's excellent. Because when I bring up this Eastern tradition, most people who are interested in this, are really Irish and English centric. And so it's great to talk to someone who, when I say it might have come from Byzantine tapestries, they don't just roll their eyes and be bored, but are actually excited that there is this connection. And in fact, a really great scholar named Michelle Brown, who was at the British Library for years and years, she's just retired pretty recently. She made the amazing discovery in the Lindisfarne Gospels that if you basically got down at the table and looked sort of put your eye right on top of the book and looked across it, you could see impressions in the paper where someone had been practicing with a quill pen without any ink on it. That they'd left traces, and she was able to spot that. And it shows, beautifully, that the person writing the Lindisfarne Gospels is trying to make some kind of hybrid script that's a mix of, so you can look at an H, and there's a definite Irish H, and there's a Greek influenced or a more traditional H, and then in between them is the hybrid one that they're creating for the font for the Lindisfarne Gospels. So there's a real intentional blending of cultures going on up here at Lindisfarne at this time.
That's amazing. One of the things that I really liked, that's one of the things that I think you're probably one of the first people when I was listening to your stuff, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that I even processed the idea that so much of what we know about the history of this time period is based on physical things that you can figure out from manuscripts, DNA of the animals used in the manuscripts, strokes, mistakes that people make. And that's just insane to me that we're talking about the decisions of individuals that we can figure out from holding these or not holding them. I'm not allowed to touch them, but from these physical objects. It's so interesting.
It is. I was just 2 weeks ago, I took my students to our archives and special collections here at Wheaton, and we have a medieval manuscript, and they went crazy touching it. Nobody wanted to give it up. Because it's this is 700 years old, and ours isn't even 1,000 years old, the Anglo-Saxon things. And you can see on the one we have, you can actually see the outline of the sheep's back leg and its armpit because of how it's an odd shape because they ran out of sheep and they needed a really big a big piece of parchment to do. It's a musical manuscript, and they wanted to be able to hold it up, we assume, so that everybody in the choir could read the music, because it was too expensive to have a little music for each person. So you made a really large one and held it up for everybody to see. But yes, so much of what we know, and we have the histories, right? We have Bede's history, and that's where we get a lot of this information. And we have a couple other things, the Liber Vitae at Durham Cathedral. It's basically the book of anyone who ever made significant financial contributions to Durham Cathedral, or related to things around that area, to Lindisfarne and so forth. And you would get your name in this Book of Life. And so just by looking at the handwriting of the Book of Life and the names that are there and how they change over hundreds of years, we're able to sort of figure out what's going on there. But it is amazing that we are able to see and touch sometimes, like, the actual things, like St. Cuthbert. So St. Cuthbert is the patron saint of Northumbria. He is recruited. He comes to Lindisfarne because of Aidan. And then he became famous for his kind of spiritual athleticism. Like, when the hustle and bustle of Lindisfarne was just too much for him, he'd get on a boat and go off to Farne and live by himself on the island for months at a time. And the stories are great. It says that when he would come out, he would go into the freezing cold water and pray. But when he came out, otters would swim up and rub their body on his legs to dry him. And the eider ducks that are all over there, they're called Cuddy's ducks, Cuthbert's ducks, because supposedly they're eider down. They gave it up for him to be warm. So there's this whole kind of wonderful stories that grow up. But Cuthbert was a real person, because when Lindisfarne was sacked by the Vikings, the monks dug up Cuthbert's body in his coffin and ran away with it to keep it and protect it. And for 11 years, they walked around carrying this coffin.
Oh my gosh.
Until they found a spot. So first they ended up at Chesterley Street, where they stayed for a while, but they decided that that wasn't right for them. So they went to Durham Cathedral, and where it wasn't Durham Cathedral then, and then they built the cathedral over the coffin. But the coffin has been saved, and it was opened up in 1827. And they found inside it Cuthbert's body and Cuthbert's pectoral cross, which was made of gold, and it's got these garnets. It's a really beautiful little thing, and a comb and a little book. And I mean, we have those things now. The St. Cuthbert Gospel, also called the Stonyhurst Gospel, because that college had it for a while. It's still in the original binding. It was buried with his body for hundreds of years. And the pectoral cross, I mean, I wasn't supposed to touch it, but an art historian was working on it, and it was there, so I went over and just touched it. I mean, so this is still, these things that, you know, they're stories, and if we didn't have this physical, material, we would think, oh, it's a nice story, that his body was uncorrupt when it was open, and then somebody opens up the grave, and holy cow, there's a book wrapped up in the thing that was buried within, and a pair of scissors and a little chalice, and all of these things were, not buried with him and then carried around in a coffin for many years. It's just kind of amazing to think about how this has come down to us over all this time, and how close it came to being destroyed so many times. The Vikings destroy it. Henry VIII, in dissolution of the monasteries and wanting to, the kind of radical Protestants wanting to throw away all the bodies and all the relics of the saints. So it's kind of remarkable how some of this stuff has survived. And so when you go to Lindisfarne, what's there now is actually the ruins of a 14th century priory that was built on top. They would tear down the old monastery and build a better one. So you're in the same location where Aidan and these guys were, but the ruined buildings, which are so beautiful and amazing, are another thing entirely. And I mean, that's like the layering of history at a place like Lindisfarne.
So let's talk real quick about the Viking raids. Why did they pick Lindisfarne to attack? It
was open and exposed and rich.
Oh, okay. So easy pickings.
That was the problem. So over the Golden Age, monasteries had grown up in England, and just like universities today, monasteries could get rich because they didn't ever divide up the lands. And so, someone died and left, like, I'm going to leave a little estate to, part of my estate to this monastery so that they'll say eternal prayers for my soul. And over time, and relatively quickly, these became incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful. I mean, just like universities today. The other thing that had happened in the Anglo-Saxon period during this golden age is that you had this uniquely English institution called the double monastery. And this was a monastery of monks and a nunnery of nuns in the same location, ruled by an abbess. It always had to be ruled by a woman. And in fact, in Anglo-Saxon England, women had more power, more freedom of how they dispose of their own income and how they choose their inheritance, and in doing things like running giant, expensive monasteries than they would have again until probably the 18th century. But these monasteries were all run by women under the theory that you couldn't put a man in charge of nuns because he would exploit them. So you had a woman in charge of the nuns and the monks. Hey, whatever works, right? Use, if you're a powerful woman, use that to gain that. So anyway, what had happened is at trading intersections, at places on the coast and then navigable rivers, those were the best land, and monasteries had grown up there and become very wealthy. Well, what they weren't counting on was attacks from the sea, because that had never happened before. So when the Vikings showed up, there was nothing that could be done to stop them, because there wasn't any defense. They weren't ready for it. And instead you would just see these Viking sails on the horizon. And especially in 793, that's really the first attack. And it's on Lindisfarne. And it was terrifying, because all of a sudden these the Vikings showed up. They burned the church. They stole whatever they could. They raped and pillaged and took slaves. And there was nothing that could be done to stop them.
Do we know who any of the Vikings were on the Viking side of that raid?
I don't think we know specifically for the attack on Lindisfarne, because that was earlier. We start to know later on, like, who is leading the attacks through, Ivar the Boneless, for example, and his brothers, and those people later on, as you get closer to the closer past, like, say 850, then we have better documentation of which Vikings were where. But I think Lindisfarne raid is anonymous, because they didn't. The difference was that it wasn't until the middle of the 9th century that the Vikings started staying. Before that time, they would come, they'd smash and grab and raid, and then they would go back. And so there just wasn't any knowledge of who was doing what. It wasn't until they started, staying over the winter. And I mean, you can see how this works, right? Like, okay, let's see. It's getting cold. It's getting stormy. We could sail in an open boat across the North Sea with a bunch of other smelly Vikings, or we could stay here. Like, we're staying. So that's sort of what happens. And then you start to get to know more about the Vikings, because they're actually interacting with the English that are there, and their names are getting written down and so forth.
Now, I have one more question with you before we go. So your expertise cover, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, but also like J.R.R. Tolkien, which, if people know Tolkien's work, they'll know why someone who likes Anglo-Saxon literature would like his work. But how did you end up creating a career for yourself where you're in the middle of all of these different interesting things, that each one of which could be its own lifetime of work?
It's kind of, you looking back on it, you're like, oh, that was just destined. When I was, some family legend says 2, I don't know if I was 2 or 4, it doesn't matter really, but in the spare bedroom at my grandmother's house, my dad had put up the poster from the Lord of the Rings, from, like, the 1969 edition, the crazy poster with, like, the emus and the bulbous fruit and the lots of, like, the woman who painted it hadn't actually read the books. And I would apparently stand up and point at it and say, what that? Which I kind of still do whenever I see that picture. Like, what is that? I don't remember the giant frog amphibian thing. So I grew up loving Tolkien, and but I was focused. I went to undergrad for journalism and creative writing, and I went to grad school for journalism, and then I was going to grad school for creative writing, and I took a class in Old English because in the course catalog, Professor Foley at the University of Missouri had written Westhu Hall, which I recognized from Tolkien. And I'm like, okay, I got to take the course for this guy. And like the first day I heard Old English, I'm like, oh, this is what I want to do now. I know what I want to do. And so I was trained as a medievalist, as a Anglo-Saxonist, doing like really, I think pretty technical stuff on Beowulf and focusing on tradition in Anglo-Saxon. But I always had the interest in Tolkien. And then I was at the British Library, at Oxford, And I was doing some research for my dissertation, and I said, I'm going to look at the early drafts of Tolkien's famous article, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. So even if he'd never written The Lord of the Rings, he'd be famous in my field for this article that he wrote about. And I realized actually he'd written an entire book and just sort of drawn the best parts for the article, and that was incredibly exciting. And then I wrote to the Tolkien estate and said, I would like to do an edition of this book. And to my shock, they said yes. And that sort of got me working on Tolkien. And that just happened to be, and it really was a coincidence. Then the Peter Jackson films started coming out, and like people would say, hey, there's this guy Drout who's working on Tolkien. And, I ended up getting in touch with the Tolkien scholarly community and founding the journal Tolkien Studies. And it all just kind of fit together and happened from there. And I'm just very lucky that I was able to keep, to unify my different areas of interest.
If listeners want to find more of your works, where would you suggest they go first?
They can go to michaeldrout.com, which is a website that needs a lot of updating. I keep hiring students to do it, and then they end up graduating before they finish. So I need to take care of that myself. So that would be one place. And I am occasionally, or not regularly enough, but on Twitter as just at Mike Drout. And that's probably the two best places to find me that way. And yeah, I think I really need to fix that website, but I keep having more fun writing new stuff than like fixing up websites about the old.
Well, people should, if listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, go download one of his Modern Scholar lecture series, and then I promise you'll get hooked and you'll just keep going.
And the one thing I should have said about Lindisfarne and in general is I do work for a company called Scholarly Sojourns, and I lead tours to these places.
Cool. That's awesome.
I've led a few tours of there's one tour that's Anglo-Saxon Britain that we start up in the north and do Lindisfarne and Monkwearmouth Jarrow and Whitby, and then kind of work our way down the coast and do the Sutton Hoo treasure and the burial and the Parker Library in Cambridge, and finally end up working all the way to Winchester and Winchester Cathedral. And so I lead those pretty much every summer from Scholarly Sojourns. There's one on Anglo-Saxon Britain, and there's one on Vikings and sagas in Iceland. So I will be doing those this summer as well. So those are another way, and those are really fun. Scholarly Sojourns does a great job of making it so that I, as the professor, don't have to worry about all the logistical stuff. So I can just teach and talk with the people on the tour the whole time, and that makes it a lot of fun.
That's amazing.
I'm not having to book hotels and nonsense like that. I can just go teach about the stuff in the actual locations. That
sounds so cool. Well, I think that listeners, anybody who's interested, should definitely check that out, because that sounds like a really fun trip. And thank you so much for coming on. You were one of the first people who I listened to. I think I listened to a podcast interview with you with the Tolkien professor, and then I went and sought out all your stuff, and you've just been a huge inspiration. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you, and thank you for what you're doing too, because these amazing places and this information, it can all die out if people don't care about it.
Yeah, that's true.
When you get people to look at it and touch it, or just click through things and listen about it, then people care, and then we have a chance to pass it on to another generation. So I think it's incredibly exciting that this medium of podcast developed, and that there are people who are like history fans. That just makes my day when I talk to someone who's a history fan, history fangirl, I should say, right? Is that's your it makes my day, because sometimes we in academia, we get isolated from the people that we really that are our natural supporters, and so it's good not to be alienated and to find people who really love and care about this material.
Thank you. That is really, really kind. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
No problem, and I enjoyed talking to you.